Crafting a brand story that actually connects with your audience can be difficult. Ever wonder how the pros do this? In today's episode, we're speaking with Michelle Vasquez, a Stanford-educated brand strategy expert who's worked with some of the biggest names. She's sharing insider secrets on how to align your message with what your audience truly cares about. She'll reveal the biggest mistakes businesses make when telling their story. Michelle will explain how storytelling and communication strategies are backed by strong research to help her clients succeed. Here, we're all about communication at work. Welcome to the Storytelling Movement podcast. Today, we are welcoming Michelle. Michelle, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
I am a brand marketing strategist and storyteller. I have my own brand consultancy called the M Group. And what I specialize in doing is helping people figure out how to resonate with their audience by telling an authentic brand story.
Excellent. And when you say people, is that a certain kind of entrepreneur? Is that a certain kind of business? Do you work across the gambit? Who are you working with more often than not?
You know, I really work across the gamut. My background is in corporate marketing, so I've worked for AT&T, Levi's, and Visa, and since then I've worked for agencies, consultancies in UT, San Antonio. I have also worked for some nonprofits in the nonprofit space, so it's really about talking to anybody that has a story to tell.
And have you noticed some common themes in regard to challenges across those different businesses?
I think the biggest challenge is people need to have a clear understanding of what they're trying to communicate and who they are trying to communicate to. Because if you don't know who your audience is and you don't know who they are, then it's hard to craft a message that's going to be resonant and relevant.
And how do you help your clients get to answer that question? Because I know market research can be a very artistic and not just scientific thing.
Absolutely. You know, it happens a number of ways. We start with a process with a discovery session where I put together a series of questions based on what I have read about them through what is publicly available. And then I try to dig deeper to see what they have to say that may be the same or different or to identify any gaps. After that process, if the possibility exists of doing some research with either existing audience members they have or new audience members that they want to have, then I will create a discussion guide and we'll do an on-Zoom consulting session, if you will, or focus group.
Excellent. Can you shed some light on what kinds of things are discussed in those discovery calls more often than not, and what people need the help with in those discovery calls more often than not?
I think that it's really a conversation and a get to know you session, because the better I can get to know the person that I'm trying to help, the better I can help communicate in the tone of voice and identify the relevant story that is going to really bring them to life. I would say that more often than not, the challenge that we have is that they have thought about what they want to say, but not to who they want to say it. And that is why sometimes there is a disconnect, because often what we think of as communication priorities may not be the priorities of the listener. And we really are trying to engage with the listener. And so it's very important that we push the buttons that they say are important to them. And that's where the market research comes in.
And can you give us some examples of where those things haven't aligned in the past? Like the customer thinks this, the client thinks this. Where do we more often than not see those wires getting crossed? And where do you have to maybe gently correct the client to say, well, actually, your customers are over here and you're talking to people who are over here, but they're not interested in you?
I think that we really just generate a discussion guide that is based off of aided and unaided questions, and open-ended questions. So we start off with a very broad approach to find out, what people think of your brand, or when they think of your brand, your product, your service, whatever it is you're trying to sell.
Can you describe some of the common pain points that you find that your clients can address more often than not? Like, I know that we all talk about different pain points and problems to be solved, but are there some common ones that you see appearing again and again for your clients?
I would say probably one of the most common pain points is a disconnect in what attributes they're trying to emphasize. So as an example, I worked for Levi's for many years, and we had two distinct customer bases. One was Spanish speaking and the other was English speaking. In the English speaking market, freedom and empowerment and self-expression were really important. In the Spanish speaking market, it was really more about being American and being original and that Americana mindset. So all of those were appropriate for the brand, but depending upon who they were speaking to, they had to emphasize different attributes.
Wow, so there's a lot of cultural and intercultural work being done here. Can you speak a little bit more to the differences between how different subcultures might appreciate or not appreciate these kinds of persuasive messages?
Sure. I think that there is overt selling and then there is covert selling. And depending upon nationality, depending upon interest, one may be more appealing than the other. And again, it just really makes it important to know who it is you're trying to speak to.
And can you break down for our audience the difference between covert and overt and what that might look like in real life?
Sure. So a covert sale might be just putting an Instagram post and a teaser of what you are trying to communicate. In exposure to that message, people will then begin to remember you. They may be curious. They may decide they're going to click on your Instagram post or make a comment, and then you begin the engagement thereon. In the other example of overt selling, it's really just direct to consumer. Act now, call this number, book your free consultation. I've been known to do that occasionally. So
excellent. So covert sounds like content marketing, right? What are some of the things that you recommend your clients do for that kind of static, always on, always speaking to an audience kind of messaging?
I would say the first thing is be needs-based. Know what your audience needs, and then tailor your message to that, and then try to close the sale or close the referral or close the word of mouth or the commentary. So as an example, if you are trying to get someone to come to your restaurant, then you may have a special offer to get them to come in. And so that's a very direct way with connecting to, if your favorite meal is burgers with fries, then here is an offer that will bring you in to see us.
Excellent. And we've zoomed into one specific part of the marketing process. I need to zoom out so that we can give our audience some context. Can you take us through the stages that you go through when planning these kinds of messaging strategies? Like, you have a start with planning and research, and then you move into the kind of execution and evaluation stages, or do you have a specific framework that you use to create a good plan for marketing?
Sure. There's a number of different tools that I use. Most of them, again, start with the discovery process. It's like really trying to understand what my client is trying to achieve. And if they don't know what they're trying to achieve, because sometimes they don't, then helping them tease out that information. Secondly, once we go through the discovery phase, I'll put together an executive summary of what I heard and what I think we should do next. And the next part includes a number of different tools. It could include some focus groups to identify some research. Once the research is completed, then I would write another report which indicates how those insights apply to their business and what they can do to take action and meet the needs or the specific insights of that particular client. One of the insights might be if you were doing focus groups on frozen food and you found out that packaging was very important to people in making their choices because of environmental causes, then you would communicate that you have recyclable packaging. That would be an attribute that would be at the top of the list, and that is therefore actionable. You can put it on the packaging itself. You can put it in the advertising, but whatever you do, it needs to be consistently mentioned because it's important to the consumer. Sometimes people think that it's just about the product itself, but oftentimes it's about what surrounds the product. And then if you want to take that a step further, then another insight could be that people care about companies that care about the environment. So it might not only be an individual choice of what to choose to put on their table for frozen food, but it may also be supporting a company that does good things for the environment.
One of my papers back in the day was about values-based advertising and values advocacy advertising, which at the time it was really coming of age. And it seems like that trend is only accelerated. That idea of connecting with the values of the audience as key to making sure that you're reflecting what they say and what they believe so that you can attract that kind of customer. Can you speak more to how people do that in the context of service-based businesses? We talked about a great example of a product-based business. What about a service-based business that you might have worked with in the past?
Sure. Well, I think service-based businesses like consulting practices, as an example, can demonstrate their support of the community, because businesses do businesses with people they trust. And if you are a trusted face within the community, then knowing that you support the Rotary Club or knowing that you support the softball team at your kid's school can all be very meaningful ways to show that you are not just a business that is out to make a profit and get money, but also to be a longstanding member of your community.
Excellent. Earlier, you talked about how sometimes businesses and clients don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know exactly what they need to do, and you're going about the process of helping them to get to that answer. What kind of questions do you ask the client before you even start talking to the audience? What are the kinds of core questions that help you to uncover those kinds of insights for your clients?
I really think it's the basics of journalism and of storytelling, which is the who, the what, the where, the why, and the when. That everybody has a different way that they answer those. And sometimes there can be confusion as to the who. Who we think we want to target may be who we aspire to target, but maybe who may not be appropriate to target currently. So it really takes some pushing and some thinking and some creating some stretch in the conversation so that people can be willing to explore. And if they don't want to explore a certain area, then there's probably a reason why. And it's my job as a consultant to try to figure out that why.
It's kind of an archaeology, isn't it? You're uncovering the things that client needs to know to be able to share their gifts and their expertise with the world.
It's like psychotherapy for businesses. It really, it's trying to identify the root cause and then address it.
You've addressed the root cause, uncovered the real problems. You have created great research on both the client and the situation that the client is in and the audience. You've done amazing research on both sides. What about objectives? Do you set objectives at that point? And what does that look like? What does that process look like?
Well, the objectives actually drive all of it, right? And that is part of the intake process during discovery. It's, who do you want to talk to? Why do you want to talk to them? How will you measure success? How will you think about the future of your business, and how will this engagement create results for you? And what do those results look like? And that drives the action questions we would ask in the research. But it all needs to come full circle. So once the research is completed, it's really about the metrics. And did we achieve either the messaging that you wanted to achieve? Did it generate the actions and the behaviors that you wanted to change as a result of communicating with this audience? Yeah, I think that they're all important, and it kind of goes in a circle, if you will. And then you just iterate the process. You may find out, for example, that something was extraordinarily successful. Well, what made it successful, and how will you find that out? Is it that you will do a pre and post survey? Is it that you will send out a message to your customers asking them why they liked it? There are a number of different ways you can go that don't take a lot of time. Do you do a poll on LinkedIn with your customer base? Another interesting approach in terms of future growth for a business, whether it's service-based or whether it's product-based, is being able to do that research and come back to it again and again. I think in doing that you only build upon the knowledge that you have. And now with the advent of AI, you can actually test some hypotheses there. So I don't think AI is anything to be afraid of. I think it's something to be embraced and integrated.
I really want to know more about how we are leveraging AI. But just to recap for our audience, so we've talked about the situation, we've talked about the audience and the research that goes into that, including objectives, which are really embedded in that process. And we talked about evaluation and the metrics that you might get. I want to be sure that we talk about strategies and tactics, but first, let's talk more about AI and how you're leveraging AI.
I think AI is a wonderful tool. I mean, I think it needs to be used with caution and not as the only tool that you're using. As an example, if you are going to be doing some research and you're going to test some messaging in that, maybe that's part of your objective is to figure out what resonates the best. You can use AI to generate a few different options. And then you can talk through those options with your client to see which ones resonate the best with what they had in mind. And then you go out and you test it, right? You tweak it, you input it. It's not just taking data from a machine. It's responding to that data, and it's responding in such a way that you add your own flair. So it's like painting, right? You add your own brush strokes, you take out, you delete, you disregard anything that doesn't apply, and then you go from there. So that's one way to use it. Another is in consistency of tonality. As you tell a story with your brand voice, you want to make sure that that voice is consistent. And AI is great for learning your own voice and then telling you, you skewed off base here, so you need to tweak it a little bit. AI is equally a mutual learning tool, and I like to think of it that way.
When you mention brand voice, I'm sure people might be thinking, well, wait a second, what does that look like? And is it different for different clients in the way that you would share it with the machine? Because I can imagine when working with a healthcare client, you may not have the same advice as when working with a product client or a product-oriented client. Whenever you're sharing these sorts of prompts with the AI and asking for feedback, is there an art to the way that you're sharing and asking these kinds of questions?
I think there is an art to it, but I don't think that anyone has truly mastered that yet. And again, it's a mutual learning tool. In terms of how we frame the brand voice, it is different from person to person, from brand to brand. And part of what I would use in the discovery process, I would actually also use as an AI prompt. So let's say I did an interview with one of my clients and they gave me a quotation. I might take that quotation and put it into AI because that is in their words and not mine.
That really helps you to get inside the mind of your client so that you can articulate the case for the business in the language that they're actually using, which is a great benefit of AI. So we've talked about AI as a great strategy or tactic for refining brand voice and messaging. What are some other strategies and tactics that you find yourself going to again and again for your clients?
I think really focusing on the need and making sure that the value proposition is differentiating. And that is, again, fed by the consumer research. So you'll hear me talk about that again and again because I think it's so important. But when you take that data and you feed it into not only what your business objectives are, and let's say you start a project and you have specific objectives, but you find out something different from the research, you need to incorporate that back in to your objective setting, right? In doing that, you can only improve the process.
I hate to put you on the spot here, but I'm going to. Can you think of an example where you were working with a client and you had to make sure that you followed that process of alignment and making sure that your objectives were aligning with your strategies and tactics in a substantive way to reflect that value proposition that you're talking about?
I did some work recently with a client who was testing some creative concepts for their advertising. People understood them to stand for, this institution, and I can't name the institution, but an institution in the education space, and it had a reputation. And that reputation was something that was a household name and that many people would have heard of and felt good about. When we did some research, their objectives were to figure out how to engage at a greater level with alumni. And when we did research with alumni, we realized that what was most important to the alumni was not what was being communicated to the greater and broader audience, which were prospective students. And those two dimensions were really different. So when communicating to the alumni-based audience, they really needed to foster that sense of community and networking and friendship building, versus when they communicated to prospective students, it was really about focusing on education and career development and, the 4 years, if you will, as well as affordability. It's the same brand, the same voice, two different messages to two different audiences. Does that make sense?
Yes. And it's so exciting because you're uncovering the secret, right? Isn't it exciting?
It is
when you
exciting.
Find something that doesn't add up. You're like, this doesn't add up. This isn't what they want to hear. This isn't what they want to invest in. And to find that gap and be able to take that to a client and say, this is where we're going wrong, but I have a solution. I have the way to fix the problem, right? I think that's a really exciting thing that I think a lot of marketers, a lot of advertisers, a lot of people in public relations or the persuasion professions can really get excited about.
I just want to add one more thing, which is, very often if a client starts out with a vision of what they see and you kind of know that it's not necessarily the path they need to take, when they have the research and they hear it straight from the consumer or from the audience, they're more likely to adapt moving forward because it's based on data. It's not just based on a gut instinct.
This is a theme, and I love that you're so research focused because it really is the foundation of a good marketing plan. That research to show us where the audience is actually at versus where we think they might be at. And it's really interesting too, because you have described the customer journey in one area of business where they're starting to interact with the business. Before they even interact with the business, they have expectations. They have wants, they have needs, they have desires that need to be fulfilled by that business. And then after they've interacted with the business, the relationship isn't over and the business still needs to make a case for engagement with those former clients in this case.
Right.
Can you describe how you articulate the customer journey for clients? Do you tell stories? Do you layer that with facts? Can you give us an example of a customer journey arc that maybe you have used in a presentation with your clients in the past?
Sure. I hate to be old-fashioned, but, there are some models that work time after time, and that's the funnel-based model. Top of the funnel to bottom of the funnel to conversion to action. And, that's something that I rely on a lot because it's where are you in your journey? If you're a new startup, you're going to definitely be top of the funnel and just about awareness building. Yes, you want conversion, but conversion won't come overnight. It takes building up again and again. So that's a tool that I use pretty frequently.
Hey, can you take us to the top of the funnel and give us some strategies and tactics that are useful for that? And then maybe talk a little bit about the differences between that and the bottom of the funnel.
Sure. In a nutshell, the top of the funnel and the bottom of the funnel, one is knowing your name and the other is taking an action that you want them to take. And so when we talked earlier about covert and overt marketing, overt marketing is more the bottom of the funnel. And that's the point where you know that you've addressed a need, they know who you are, and then you're just closing. You're saying what's it going to take to get this relationship to move forward. I'm going to tell you this, and it's going to sound a little funny, but it's like any relationship or friendship. You first have to say hello. If nobody says hello, there's no relationship. And so for people who may not have a lot of experience in marketing, which some of my clients do not, I try to explain it to them in terms that make sense. And it's like everybody gets that if nobody says hi, there is no relationship. And once you say hi, if you want a friendship, you have to go back again and you have to make an invitation and you have to engage. And it has to happen repeatedly a certain number of times before finally that relationship, that trust, that credibility clicks. And once that trust and credibility clicks, and you're ready to address the need and close the sale. So some of the tactics that I might use in that situation are very broad level, some stealth tactics to develop word of mouth. And that could happen in the virtual or the physical world. In the physical world through street teams or influencers. In the virtual world, it could be social media influencers. It could be through public relations. Public relations is a great and I think highly underutilized method for getting the word out without having to pay for advertising. And then, of course, there's social media. So those are three tactics I think that work very well for building top of the funnel awareness from the ground up, because not everybody is a Coca-Cola and starting from up here. Some people are starting from down here, and you just have to know that it's going to be a long journey and that there is a process to follow to get through that. In terms of more advanced metrics or more advanced approach tactics, rather, I would say that I don't look at them as more advanced tactics so much as old-fashioned tactics which are asking for the sale, contact forms, payment for referrals or incentives for referrals, direct-to-consumer 800 numbers, or direct response, email. Email is having a resurgence right now, just based on all of the different dynamics that are going on in the world. I highly think it's effective, and so there is an art to writing the email header line. And that's where it's at. So,
and you mentioned all those touch points, and email is one of those touch points. There's some research that suggests that you have to interact with a brand or a company at least 8 times before you buy. For some of us that are more impulsive, maybe it's less, but there's a lot of truth to that. And all those strategies you were listing, I was thinking touch point. Yes, this is exactly what we need. You also mentioned street influencers. What are street influencers?
Street influencers are like social media influencers, but they're in the community. It may be your muralist. It may be your beautician. It may be your local comedian. They are people in the community that have a following locally that can get the word out and that people trust and have a credibility for. It could be an anchor person. It could be any of those things. So that's an example of a street team. In terms of the virtual world, the social influencers are pretty obvious. So
yeah, I think our audience understands social influencers really well. But because most of our audience are digital natives, right? They might say, well, wait a second, what's this street thing? So does that look like going to a comedian and offering payment for mentions? Like going to a beautician and saying, hey, can you naturally bring up our client in your conversations with your client? How does that look? What's the ethical way there?
I think it's more of a PR play. So you identify your audience, you figure out what the message is going to be, and then you entice them to participate in, say, a distribution of your product. Maybe it's you send it to them as a gift and say, if this is something you're interested in, I'd love it if you could create a joke around this or something to that.
That is such an interesting thing. You're going straight to the person who has the influence and you're giving them an opportunity to engage with the brand with the explicit ask of mention what we are doing to your audience, please. Well, it's not subtle, is it? It's a direct ask for help from that street influencer.
Yeah, it can be direct. It can also be indirect. I mean, I think that if you have done your homework on who your audience is and you know that they have credibility with that audience, then it's going to happen naturally because you're going to be meeting that need, meeting the need of their audience, and they will see that. If it's not authentic and if it's fake, they will also see through that, and you could actually damage your reputation. So there's a very fine line and there's a very subtle approach, but this is the business of commerce and this is the business of influence these days.
You mentioned the possibility of damaging the brand. Do you have any examples where you've seen brands damaged by marketing tactics that didn't work?
Sure. I think that big brands who have had sponsorships with certain personalities have often seen that backfire because there were popularity contests, but not necessarily values alignment.
I just thought of one.
Okay.
Subway and Jared.
That's right.
That was a nightmare. You have a brand spokesperson who's literally going to jail for one of the most awful things you can think of on the planet. And it's damaging the brand because that marketing tactic of relying solely on that expert, like you were talking about, led to bad outcomes.
Exactly. And I think that you have to go in with a broad set of tactics, and you have to always be above the line with ethics. I mean, that goes without saying. Well, actually, it doesn't go without saying. Let me state it explicitly. Ethics are of the utmost concern. But if you are being authentic to who you are, with a brand or service that is authentic to who you are, meeting the needs of the audience that you serve, including influencers, because influencers are also your audience. They just are. Then, you should be set up for success. The most that an influencer can do is say no. And if they don't, that's okay. And that's their prerogative. There is not an alignment of the brand, and trying to persuade somebody to be inauthentic is not really going to help you at all.
And you're looking at those brand values too and saying what aligns. So you're like, okay, you value the environment, we value the environment. You value this cause, we value this cause. And if there's alignment there, then you take away the opportunities to say no, because it's a no-brainer offer, right?
That's right.
How do we build those no-brainer offers for influencers, for our audience, for our clients? I know that there's probably some ingredients there that make a really great offer.
At the risk of repeating myself, it really goes back to need, because if you're addressing what they need, they may have emotional needs. They may also have functional needs. Emotional needs may be they want to feel good about the company that they're supporting and that their company is supporting the community. A functional need might be it needs to be at the right price point. Another functional need might be it needs to fit in my garage. All three of those things come into play, so your messaging needs to target those things. If you are in alignment, then they're going to work. What I would also say is that regarding alignment, when you are approaching an influencer, these talks don't just happen. It's not just a cold call email. It goes back to the relationship building. It may be an email to start. There may be a conversation. There could be a meeting. It is a long journey. It is a process. And so I don't want to undercut the process itself.
Whenever you're setting expectations for your clients, how do you frame the timeline? Because you just mentioned it's a long process, and I'm sure that timelines look different for different kinds of clients. But there are certainly phases within that timeline that might match up more often than not. Like the first phase is this, the second phase is that. Can you speak a little bit to how you articulate the timeline for clients who want to garner that kind of influence?
Absolutely. I think it depends upon a lot of things. So one of them is what the objectives are. And generally, if it's a 2-week turnaround, it's just not going to happen. There needs to be a commitment. You're either going to almost get married or not, right? You have to make that commitment to the process. In general, timing would be about 6 weeks for discovery to research to initial recommendations. Then depending upon the recommendations, the budget, the objectives, we would set up a short, mid, and long-term process. And they may only decide to go with a short-term process, and that's fine because the short-term process would be designed specifically for the objectives that they had in mind. And if they decide at that point that then they want to move into the midterm and into the long term, then those things would ensue as well.
Can you give us some ideas of what those kinds of budgets look like with the short-term timeline and the long-term timeline? And I know it's all across the board for your clients, and you have a lot of variation there. But for our audience who is trying to wrap their head around the media buying and how much that cost, and your services and how much that cost, and the full service agency model, or the specific, targeted scalpel model, right?
Right.
Break down the differences between the very large and the very small in terms of budget to hire you.
Sure. So a good range would be $3,000 for a month versus $30,000 for a month. And, when you're dealing with an independent consultant, they don't have a lot of the overhead. They may work with a consortium of partners, as I do, to bring in the other elements that are required for execution. Or sometimes the client will have those resources in-house. And so you're really just helping them develop the strategy, the insights, the value proposition, and so forth. If you're working with a full-scale agency that has media buying, account planning, social media, PR, just all of the things, then you would probably be looking at a team of people that are serving you that are all billable by the hour. So an independent consultant is probably more likely to bill you by the project versus by the hour. If you've got 30 people in a room for a meeting and that's an average of $150 to $200 a person, that can add up very, very quickly. And that's before the work gets done. That's just the meeting time. Those are things that you need to think about. And when you're developing a relationship, whether it's with somebody large or somebody small, there's a place for both. It just depends upon what your needs are.
It sounds like you as an independent contractor have a really strong case against 30 people in the room, but I like how you said, but it really depends on what you want, and qualifying that sometimes people do need those larger agencies.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really turnkey. And, you know, the focus of my entrepreneurship is really on the front end of the process, that strategy, that value proposition, that messaging, that communication, that developing of the go-to-market plan. That's really my sweet spot, if you will. And then I have other folks that I go to for some of the other outsourcing of media buying or execution.
These discovery sessions, these strategy sessions, when you're first speaking with the client and you're giving them a snapshot of what it could be costing them, I'm sure you're including the kinds of things that you're doing too. Can you walk us through that kind of pitch for our audience who might be thinking about doing brand strategy the way that you do brand strategy?
Essentially, I develop a scope of work. After I've done the discovery, there's an initial consultation and then there's the discovery. The initial consultation, I get to know the general things that I would need to know in terms of objectives, budget, et cetera, and timeline. Once I understand those things, then I put together a recommendation on what I think I heard to make sure that we're aligned, that I heard the right things, and that I'm going to be focusing my scope of work on the right things. And then I develop the actual scope of work, which is if a client needs a go-to-market plan, then we'll do the discovery, we'll do the research, we'll do the development of the plan, and we'll do a final report with recommendations, as well as metrics and things of that nature. And then we'll go into the execution of actually making it happen. But my experience generally is that I've done enough of the listening initially, and that's a key skill that you need to have, that I generally get it right the first time. But sometimes not always. Sometimes people change their minds, or sometimes there's just lack of alignment. And then that's a conversation. It's a relationship. And I like to think that all of my clients I have good relationships with. So that's just an important way of doing business. They are my clients. I am there to serve them and to make sure that I give them what they need.
What you just walked us through is going to help so many people who are thinking about how to service their clients better, because that listening that you highlighted applies to all kinds of service-based businesses and product-based too, right? Where you're really doing deep listening to figure out the kinds of things that you can help your client with, and to figure out the alignment with where you can help take your client and close gaps in their business. As you are getting to the core of what your client needs and identifying those needs and uncovering those needs, do you have a checklist in the back of your mind, solutions that more often than not solve the problems and those needs for your clients? Or is every single one unique and you have to go and you have to really find new solutions every time?
I think that in general, they're all different because everybody's context is different. Everybody's budget's different. Their timing is different. Their objectives are different. There are definitely tools in the toolbox, and I have a palette of colors, if you will. But it's not so much a cookie cutter approach, because if I've done my job well, then it is an opportunity to learn something new. And I love that about my work. I like to learn something new so I can figure out how to customize a solution tailor-made with the colors in my toolbox. And if I don't have the toolbox, then I go find new tools, and that's the process of discovery. So the discovery session is really a two-way street. It's not only for the client to communicate what their needs are, but it's an opportunity for me to listen as an outside person in an objective way to what they are saying, and to compare that to the context of tools that I had in my head from all of my years of experience. Or I saw a funny meme the other day, and it said, the value of what I bring you is not based on the hours I spend on your project. It may take me 15 minutes to design something for you, but the cost is based on the years of experience it took me how to learn to do it in 15 minutes. I think that's kind of an interesting, pithy saying.
Absolutely. It reminds me of the story of the plumber who goes and fixes it real fast, and then it says that'll be, a large amount of money. And it's like, well, I need that bill itemized. Well, here's the itemization. The actual work costs this, the how to do it, knowing how and why and where and all the things to fix that problem. That's where the bulk of the cost lies, because your expertise and how you are able to impact the world with your expertise is derived from all that experience and all that learning and all that education that you've gone through to help your clients. And in the business of expertise, you have to make sure that you're pricing things fairly. And especially with AI and the cost of intelligence, AI intelligence, of course, not human intelligence, but the cost of intelligence being projected to fall, that becomes more and more important for these kinds of service-based businesses to make sure that they're charging what they're worth.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But, sometimes it's not just about the money. More often than not, it's just not about the money. It's about doing a good job and doing a service for somebody and being helpful. And so I pride my own brand on that, which is to be of service, to address needs, and to be helpful.
Excellent. What else sets you apart, Michelle? I know that the being helpful and the making sure that you're serving your clients at the highest level are important. But since you've done this kind of work for so many clients in the past, I'm sure you've done it for yourself and your business too. Can you share a little bit about that unique differentiating factor that is your business?
Sure. I think my special sauce is that I'm able to uncover interesting and very often surprising insights that break stereotypes and differentiate my clients from others. And I think I'm able to do that because I've worked for big companies. I've worked for startups. I've worked for across financial services, telecommunications, fast food and retail, and education, nonprofits. I've facilitated, I've done research, I've worked as an agency planner, I work as an agency account executive, and I worked on the corporate side. So I think, and I'm from a small town, I've lived in big towns, I've lived in New York and San Francisco and here in San Antonio. So I think that all of that is an education in its own right, and that gives me the context of being able to compare similarities between things and disparities between things. And I think that that's what makes me different.
I love that answer. As you were listing all these ingredients that go into the special sauce, one that stuck out to me was that you've worked with nonprofits. And the reason it stuck out is because we often ask our students to start with serving nonprofits. Can you give our students some common insights that you might have seen in working with nonprofits specifically?
I would say that some of the differences I've seen is how they interpret what marketing is and what communications is. And actually, I would say that here in San Antonio, that marketing communications is not distinguishable, that they are both put into the same bucket, and that it tends to skew more communications oriented. Marketing is a traditional form of study or of tactic is often confused with PR and communications and media relations. So I would say that as you're thinking about working with a nonprofit, that you need to be prepared that is the expectation, and that if you are truly going to bring a marketing or a branding point of view with you, that you need to make sure that that's something that they want and need. First of all, that they understand the difference, want it and then need it, or need it and then want it. And that if you are going into marketing and branding, that education process can take a long time. So I would spend some time first asking them what their definition of marketing is and branding as well as communications, and then taking that nugget and working with that on your own time to develop how you're going to explain it in a very short way.
That sounds incredibly useful to anyone working with any business, but especially nonprofit with maybe more limited budgets and more limited scope for what they're trying to accomplish. How do you break apart marketing, communications, PR, branding, performance branding, awareness branding? How do you break those things apart so that your nonprofit client can understand them more easily?
I really try to focus on helping them understand everything is about changing behaviors, but it's about the funnel. And then I'll usually go through the funnel. If you're up here and it's branding, then it's probably going to be PR, media relations, things of that nature. If you're doing marketing, then there is a different kind of a metric, and it's measured in conversions, it's measured in donations, it's measured in engagement. It can be any one of those things. So that's the basic difference I see.
As you explain the difference between performance metrics like volunteers, the actual donations given, and the things that marketing accomplishes versus the awareness metrics, do you find yourself having to make a case for both? Or do you find yourself more easily able to communicate one or the other?
Again, I think it depends upon the scope of the budget. I'm able to live in both worlds, but I think that for what a client needs, if they're a smaller organization, their resources are probably smaller. They probably can't afford to do both, so they should focus more on the conversion-based metrics and the performance marketing, because then they can say, I've spent this amount of money and this is what we've gotten back in return, and then maybe they can ask for more budget, things of that nature. On the other hand, if it's a little bit of a larger organization that is maybe a little bit better established financially, then it's really best to have all of the aspects of branding as well as performance-based metrics.
It is so true, because they work hand in hand, right?
Yeah.
You have to have that top of funnel in order to get to bottom of funnel. You have to have that awareness in order to get to performance. What can people do today to improve their marketing skills?
I would say that one trial and error is one way to do it. Often people will set up a separate account to test new things on social media as they're trying to learn. Another way to go is to use AI to teach you things. And a third way to go is to, if you have LinkedIn Premium, they offer several courses online that are related to marketing, or you can join your local organization, the AMA.
Excellent. And Michelle, where can people find you online?
I am on LinkedIn. You can reach me at Michelle Vasquez at LinkedIn.
Michelle, can you spell that out for our listening audience?
Sure. It's MichellelleMVasquez at LinkedIn.
Excellent. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wisdom and expertise. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Appreciate you.